when 17-year-old Grace Elizabeth Parker's father shattered her arm with a mining pick handle for bringing home only $3 instead of $5, then dragged her to the dusty streets of Tombstone to beg with her mangled limb as bait. For sympathy coins, she thought her life couldn't sink any lower until Lucas Riverbend, a Navajo tracker with scars of his own, saw past her shame and decided that some cruelties were worth fighting no matter the cost. The Arizona Territory sun beat down mercilessly on the wooden boardwalks of Tombstone, turning the air into visible waves of heat that danced above the dusty streets like ghosts of better days. Grace Elizabeth Parker sat crumpled against the weathered post outside Murphy's General Store, her left arm bent at an unnatural angle, the bone having set wrong after her father's latest rage 3 weeks ago. The crude splint he'd fashioned from fence slats and leather strips served more as a prop for pity than proper healing, and the constant throbbing reminded her of every moment since that terrible night when she'd counted the coins wrong. Her father, Silas Parker, had once been a respected mine foreman at the Silver King mine, back when silver still flowed freely and men could make honest wages digging precious metal from the desert mountains. But when the veins ran dry and the mine closed, Silas had turned to whiskey and gambling, then to darker means of survival. Now he spent his mornings sleeping off hangovers and his afternoons counting the coins Grace brought home from her forced begging, always finding her efforts lacking, always promising worse consequences if she didn't do better tomorrow. The people of Tombstone had grown accustomed to seeing Grace stationed at various corners throughout the town, her auburn hair dulled with dust, her once pretty blue dress now faded and torn at the seams. Some dropped pennies in her tin cup out of genuine sympathy, others from guilt at seeing such a young woman reduced to street begging, and many simply crossed to the other side of the street to avoid confronting the uncomfortable reality she represented. Grace had learned to recognize each type of passerby, adjusting her expression accordingly, knowing that survival depended on reading people's hearts as much as their pockets. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house would occasionally slip her biscuit wrapped in brown paper, whispering quick words of encouragement before hurrying away, afraid of being seen associating with the town's most pitiful resident. The Methodist preacher had tried twice to speak with her father about Christian charity and proper care for family, but Silas had run him off with threats and profanity that echoed down Main Street for blocks. Even the town drunk, Old Pete, would sometimes share his bottle with Grace when the pain in her arm became unbearable, though she'd learned to refuse such offers, knowing they would only lead to more trouble at home. Grace's days followed a predictable pattern of misery that had become as familiar as breathing. She would wake at dawn to her father's curses and demands for breakfast, prepare whatever scraps they had with her good hand while he criticized her slowness, then position herself at whichever street corner he designated for that day. The morning hours were often the most profitable, when shopkeepers and businessmen passed by with loose change and guilty consciences. But the afternoon sun would drain both her energy and the pedestrian traffic, leaving her to count and recount the meager coins that would determine her fate that evening. The physical pain from her poorly healed arm was nothing compared to the deeper ache of watching her dreams crumble like desert dust. Grace had always been quick with letters and numbers, helping other children with their schoolwork when she'd been allowed to attend the one-room schoolhouse on the edge of town. She'd dreamed of becoming a teacher herself someday, maybe even traveling to San Francisco or Denver, where a woman with education might find respectable work. But those dreams felt as distant as the snow-capped mountains, visible on the clearest days, beautiful but unreachable from her current circumstances. Her father's transformation from disappointed provider to cruel taskmaster had happened gradually, like watching a sunset turn to night. First came the drinking after losing his job, then the gambling debts that ate up their small savings, then the angry outbursts when Grace couldn't stretch their remaining money far enough to cover both food and whiskey. The night he'd broken her arm had started like many others, with Silas demanding an accounting of every penny she'd earned that day, but his rage had escalated beyond anything she'd experienced before. She remembered the sickening crack when the pick handle connected with her forearm, the way her vision had gone white with pain, and the terrible silence that followed as they both stared at her dangling hand. For a moment, she'd seen something like regret flicker across his face, but it had vanished quickly, replaced by the cold calculation that had become his default expression. Instead of seeking medical attention, he'd bound her arm himself, claiming doctors cost too much money and that she'd heal fine on her own. What made the situation even more unbearable was the way Silas had immediately seen her injury as an opportunity rather than a tragedy. A young woman with an obviously broken arm would earn more sympathy and coins than a healthy-looking beggar, he'd reasoned. And within days of the attack, he was positioning her at the busiest intersections in town, instructing her to let her damaged limbs show prominently and to look as pitiful as possible. The shame of using her pain as a performance nearly destroyed what remained of Grace's spirit. The other beggars and drifters who populated Tombstone's margins had initially welcomed her with the rough camaraderie of shared suffering, but Grace's obvious education and refined speech marked her as different, as someone who'd fallen from a higher place rather than been born to street life. Miguel, an old Mexican man who sold newspapers when he could afford to buy them, had taught her which corners received the most foot traffic and which types of people were most likely to contribute to her cup. Sarah, a former saloon girl who'd aged out of that profession, shared tips about reading potential donors' moods and avoiding the dangerous drunks who might mistake kindness for availability. The physical discomfort of sitting on hard wooden planks for hours at a time was amplified by the Arizona heat, which turned her simple dress into a suffocating shroud and made the metal cup so hot that handling it burned her fingers. Grace learned to position herself to catch whatever shade was available throughout the day, following the shadows as they moved across the buildings like a human sundial. Her injured arm would swell in the heat, making the crude splint even more uncomfortable, but removing it would risk losing the sympathy it generated from passers-by. Evenings brought their own terrors, as Grace would return to the ramshackle cabin on the outskirts of town, where her father would count her earnings with the intensity of a banker examining gold nuggets. Any shortfall from his arbitrary expectations would result in verbal abuse at minimum, and often worse punishment that left her with new bruises to hide beneath her sleeves. The nights when she exceeded his demands were almost worse, as his temporary good humor was inevitably followed by increased expectations and greater consequences for future failures. Sleep offered little respite, as Grace would lie on her thin mattress, listening to her father's snores and planning escape routes that seemed impossible to execute. With no money, no skills beyond basic literacy, and no allies willing to risk Silas's wrath by helping her, she felt trapped, as surely as if she were chained to the town's main street. The broken arm that served as her primary source of income was also a constant reminder of her vulnerability, making any thought of running away seem foolishly optimistic. On this particular Tuesday morning in late September, Grace noticed unusual activity around the livery stable across the street. From her usual post outside the general store, a group of well-dressed men were examining horses and discussing what appeared to be preparations for a significant journey, their voices carrying across the dusty space between buildings. She paid little attention initially, focused instead on positioning her injured arm to catch the morning light in a way that would emphasize its obvious damage. The town was preparing for its annual Founders' Day celebration, which would bring visitors from surrounding settlements and potentially increase her earnings for several days. Silas had already warned her that he expected substantial results during the festivities, threatening consequences she preferred not to contemplate if she failed to meet his inflated goals. The pressure of these expectations sat in her chest, like a physical weight, making each breath feel labored and each interaction with potential donors feel desperately important. As the morning progressed and the sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky, Grace became aware of someone watching her with unusual intensity. Unlike the quick, guilty glances she typically received, this gaze felt steady and thoughtful, as if the observer was seeing something beyond the obvious tableau of a beggar seeking charity. When she finally worked up the courage to look directly at the source of this attention, she saw a tall Native American man standing in the shade of the saddle shop's awning, his dark eyes meeting hers without the discomfort or pity she'd grown accustomed to seeing. The man was dressed in a mixture of traditional and settler clothing, with leather boots and denim pants, but also silver jewelry and a woven shirt that spoke of native craftsmanship. His long black hair was pulled back and secured with what appeared to be a beaded leather tie, and his face bore the kind of weathered dignity that came from years of facing both natural and human challenges. Most striking were his eyes, which held an intelligence and compassion that made Grace feel simultaneously exposed and protected. For several minutes, they maintained this visual connection across the busy street, with Grace feeling something shift inside her chest, a sensation she couldn't identify, but that felt different from the constant anxiety and shame that had become her normal state. The man's expression revealed no judgment or pity, but rather a kind of recognition, as if he understood something about her situation that others had missed. This unexpected moment of human connection was both thrilling and terrifying after weeks of being treated as either invisible or pitiable. When the stranger finally moved, it was with the fluid grace of someone comfortable in his own skin and confident in his place in the world. He walked directly toward her position, ignoring the curious stares of other pedestrians who seemed unused to seeing a Native American moving so purposefully through the heart of their town. As he approached, Grace felt her heart rate increase, uncertain whether she should feel hopeful or afraid of this unprecedented attention. The reactions of the townspeople to his presence told their own story of prejudice and fear. Mrs. Caldwell clutched her reticule tighter and hurried her daughter away from the approaching figure, while the barber emerged from his shop to watch with obvious suspicion. The banker, Mr. Thornton, paused his conversation to track the movement with narrowed eyes, his hand instinctively moving toward the pistol at his hip. These responses were painfully familiar to Grace, who'd watched similar reactions directed at anyone who didn't fit the narrow definition of acceptable society. "Miss," he said when he reached her corner, his voice carrying the slight accent common to those who'd learned English as a second language, but spoke it with careful precision. "My name is Lucas Riverbend, and I believe you deserve better than this." His words were spoken quietly, meant for her ears alone, but they carried a weight of conviction that made Grace's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. The simple declaration that she deserved better treatment was so foreign to her recent experience that she struggled to process its meaning. Grace opened her mouth to respond, but found herself unable to form words, overwhelmed by the unprecedented experience of being addressed as a person worthy of respect rather than an object deserving pity. Lucas seemed to understand her speechlessness, nodding slightly as if her reaction confirmed something he'd suspected. He glanced briefly at her injured arm, and she saw his jaw tighten with what appeared to be controlled fury at the obvious. "Signs of abuse and neglect. I've been watching this town for 3 days, Lucas continued, his voice remaining low and calm, despite the intensity Grace could see in his dark eyes. And I've seen how you're treated, how you're forced to display. You're paying for coins that barely keep you alive. The accuracy of his observation sent a chill through Grace as she realized this stranger had seen through the performance her father had trained her to maintain. "You don't know me," Grace finally managed to whisper, her voice hoarse from disuse and emotion. "And you don't know what my father is capable of if he thinks someone's interfering." The warning came out despite her desperate desire for help, a testament to how thoroughly Silas had trained her to protect his interests, even at the expense of her own well-being. Lucas reached into his shirt pocket, withdrawing a small leather pouch that clinked softly with the sound of coins. "I'm going to give you money," he said clearly, "but I'm also going to give you something more valuable if you're willing to accept it." He poured several coins into her cup with deliberate ceremony, creating the appearance of a normal, charitable transaction while speaking words that carried far greater significance. The sound of approaching footsteps on the boardwalk behind Lucas made both of them tense, and Grace felt her brief moment of hope beginning to crumble as she recognized the uneven gait that belonged to her father. Silas was returning earlier than usual from whatever saloon had opened early enough to serve his morning whiskey, and his timing couldn't have been worse for Grace's first meaningful conversation in weeks. Silas Parker rounded the corner, looking every bit as disreputable as his daughter had feared, his clothes wrinkled from sleeping in them, his beard stained with tobacco juice, and his bloodshot eyes already focusing on Grace's cup to assess the morning's earnings. His expression shifted from bleary satisfaction to sharp suspicion when he noticed Lucas standing protectively near his daughter. "What's this then?" Silas demanded, his voice carrying the belligerent tone Grace had learned to fear. "Some redskin bothering my girl when she's trying to work?" The racial slur hung in the air like poison, designed to provoke and intimidate, but Lucas showed no reaction beyond a slight tightening around his eyes. Lucas turned slowly to face Silas, and Grace saw something in his posture that reminded her of stories she'd heard about wild animals confronted by predators, a coiled readiness that suggested explosive capability held in careful check. "I was having a conversation with this young lady about opportunities that might be available to someone with her obvious intelligence and determination," he replied, emphasizing the word lady in a way that highlighted the respect he was showing. Grace! What happened next unfolded with a speed that left Grace breathless. Lucas moved so quickly that she barely saw his hand move. But suddenly, Silas was gasping for air with his back against the general store's wall, Lucas's forearm pressed firmly against his throat. The entire confrontation had taken perhaps 3 seconds, and Lucas's expression remained completely calm throughout. "Let me make something very clear," Lucas said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only Silas and Grace could hear. "Him clearly, that young woman deserves respect, protection, and opportunities to build a decent life. If you continue to prevent her from having those things, you and I are going to have a much longer conversation." The threat was delivered with such matter-of-fact certainty that even Silas seemed to grasp its seriousness. Lucas released Silas as smoothly as he'd restrained him, stepping back while making it clear that the display of force had been controlled rather than impulsive. "Miss Parker," Lucas said formally, turning back to Grace while keeping Silas in his peripheral vision, "I believe you have some thinking to do about your future, and I suggest you do that thinking somewhere safe, where you won't be influenced by people who don't have your best interests at heart." Grace Elizabeth Parker stood frozen at the crossroads of her entire existence, watching her father stumble backward from Lucas Riverbend's controlled display of strength while the gathered crowd of Tombstone residents whispered among themselves about what they'd just witnessed. The morning sun had climbed high enough to eliminate the protective shadows she'd been relying on, and sweat beaded on her forehead from both the desert heat and the terror of knowing that her secret suffering had just become a public spectacle that would have consequences extending far beyond this single confrontation. Silas rubbed his throat, where Lucas's forearm had pressed against his windpipe, his bloodshot eyes darting between the Navajo man who'd humiliated him and the daughter, whose defiance he would certainly punish once they were alone again. The crowd's murmurs grew louder as words spread through the gathered onlookers about what Lucas had said regarding Grace's broken arm and forced begging, transforming her from an object of pity into a victim whose suffering demanded justice. "You think you can just waltz into this town and start making threats against decent folks?" Silas wheezed, his voice cracking with both physical discomfort and wounded pride. But his words lacked the conviction they might have carried before. Lucas had demonstrated exactly how easily he could be overpowered. The appealing to local prejudice that had served Silas well in past confrontations seemed suddenly inadequate when facing someone who commanded respect through capability rather than fear. Lucas stepped closer to Grace, his movement deliberate and protective, creating a physical barrier between her and her father, while addressing the crowd that had gathered to witness this unprecedented drama unfolding in the heart of their supposedly civilized community. "I think," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the wooden boardwalk, "that everyone here has seen enough evidence to understand that this young woman needs help, not judgment and protection, not more suffering." The validation Grace felt at hearing her situation acknowledged publicly was almost overwhelming, but it was tempered by the terrifying knowledge that she would have to live with the consequences of this exposure long after Lucas moved on to whatever business had brought him to Tombstone. Her father's eyes promised retribution that would make her previous suffering seem gentle, and the town's sudden interest in her welfare might prove as dangerous as their previous indifference. Mrs. Caldwell, the banker's wife, who had earlier hurried her daughter away from Lucas, now stepped forward with an expression of dawning horror as she really looked at Grace's condition for the first time in weeks. "My God," she whispered, her voice carrying the shock of someone who'd been willfully blind to obvious suffering happening right under her nose. "How did we let this continue for so long without doing something to help this poor child?" On the Z, guilt spreading across the faces of several townspeople was visible and immediate, as they confronted their own complicity in Grace's abuse through willful ignorance and social cowardice. The Methodist preacher, who had attempted to intervene weeks earlier, now looked ashamed of his failure to persist when faced with Silas's threats, while the sheriff, who had been noticeably absent during Grace's weeks of public begging, suddenly appeared at the edge of the crowd. Sheriff John Bean pushed through the gathered residents with the weary expression of a man who'd arrived too late to prevent trouble, but hoped he might still contain its consequences. His eyes took in the scene quickly, assessing the tension between Lucas and Silas, the obvious distress radiating from Grace, and the agitated mood of the crowd that had witnessed something they couldn't easily ignore or forget. "What seems to be the problem here?" Sheriff Bean asked, though his tone suggested he already had a good idea of what had transpired and was more interested in preventing further escalation than investigating past events. His hand rested casually on his pistol grip, but his attention was focused primarily on Lucas as the most likely source of additional trouble. Lucas turned to face the sheriff with the same calm dignity he'd maintained throughout the confrontation, showing no sign of intimidation despite being outnumbered and surrounded by people who viewed him with automatic suspicion. "Sheriff Bean," he said, his use of the lawman's name indicating he'd done his research before taking action. "I was just explaining to Mr. Parker here that his treatment of his daughter constitutes criminal abuse under territorial law." This direct challenge to official authority made several crowd members step backward, anticipating violence. But Sheriff Bean surprised everyone by nodding slowly as he examined Grace's obviously broken arm and the evidence of neglect visible in her appearance. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Riverbend," he replied, his use of Lucas's name confirming that the Navajo man's presence in town had been noted and investigated by local law enforcement. Grace felt dizzy as she realized that both men seemed to know more about each other than their first meeting should have allowed, suggesting that Lucas's arrival in Tombstone and his interest in her situation were not as spontaneous as she'd assumed. The possibility that she'd somehow become the center of a larger conflict between forces she didn't understand was both thrilling and terrifying. "It's not just an accusation," Lucas replied, gesturing toward Grace without taking his eyes off. "The sheriff, it's a documented fact witnessed by everyone in this town who chose to look the other way, while a young woman was forced to beg with an untreated broken bone because her father saw more profit in her pain than in her healing." The indictment of community complicity hit the gathered crowd like a physical blow. Silas attempted to reassert control of the situation by appealing to the racial prejudices he assumed would override any concern for Grace's welfare. "You gonna listen to some savage making up stories about how I raise my own daughter?" he demanded, his voice rising to a shout designed to rally support from townspeople who might prefer familiar bigotry to uncomfortable truth. The silence that greeted Silas's appeal was deafening, as residents who might have supported him under different circumstances found themselves unable to deny the evidence of Grace's condition that was now impossible to ignore. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house stepped forward with tears in her eyes, her voice shaking as she addressed the sheriff directly. "John," she said, using the sheriff's first name with the familiarity of longtime acquaintance, "I've been watching this girl waste away for weeks, and I've been too much of a coward to do anything about it because I was afraid of getting involved in family business that wasn't mine to judge. But Mr. Riverbend is right, and we all know it, and it's time someone with authority did something to protect her." The public admission of complicity and demand for action created a momentum that even Sheriff Bean couldn't ignore, despite his obvious reluctance to arrest a white man based on the testimony of a Native American in a territory where such distinctions still carried legal weight. His examination of Grace became more thorough as he noted details that painted an undeniable picture of systematic abuse and neglect. "Miss Parker," Sheriff Behan said gently, his voice taking on the careful tone reserved for dealing with trauma. "Victims, I need you to tell me truthfully how you came by that injury to your arm and whether you've been receiving proper medical care for it." The direct question put Grace in an impossible position, forcing her to choose between protecting her father and protecting herself. Grace looked from the sheriff to Lucas to her father, understanding that her next words would determine not just her own future, but possibly the fate of the only family she had left, regardless of how terribly he'd treated her. The weight of the decision was crushing, but the pain in her arm and the memory of weeks spent begging on dusty streets gave her the strength to speak truth that could not be unsaid. "My father broke my arm with a mining tool when I didn't bring home enough money from begging 3 weeks ago," Grace said, her voice gaining strength as she continued, "and he wouldn't let me see a doctor because he said it would cost too much, and then he made me keep begging with it broken because he said people would give me more money if they felt sorry for me." The confession felt like jumping off a cliff with no certainty of landing safely. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral, with several women gasping audibly and men muttering curses under their breath as they fully grasped the depth of cruelty they'd been witnessing without intervention. Silas's face went pale as he realized that his daughter's public testimony had just provided Sheriff Bean with grounds for arrest that no amount of racial prejudice could override. "Now wait just a minute," Silas stammered, his bravado crumbling. As the legal implications of Grace's statement became clear, she's just confused and scared, and this redskin has been filling her head with lies about her own father, who's done nothing but try to provide for her after losing his job through no fault of his own. The desperate attempt to discredit both Grace and Lucas fell flat in the face of obvious physical evidence. Lucas stepped forward again, his movement causing Silas to flinch backward in anticipation of another physical confrontation, but instead of violence, the Navajo man addressed Sheriff Bain with the measured tone of someone presenting legal arguments. "Sheriff, territorial law is clear about the criminal nature of child abuse, and the evidence speaks for itself. But more importantly, this young woman needs immediate medical attention for an injury that's been deliberately left untreated for weeks." The mention of immediate medical needs created a sense of urgency that overcame the crowd's shock and moved them toward action, with Mrs. Caldwell stepping forward to offer escort to the town's doctor, while other residents began discussing arrangements for Grace's immediate care and protection. The shift from passive observation to active assistance happened so quickly that Grace felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "I can take her to Doc Holliday," Mrs. Henderson offered, though the suggestion of consulting the town's most notorious physician raised eyebrows among residents who were familiar with his reputation for drinking and gambling. Or maybe we should send for the new doctor who just arrived from back east and set up practice near the hotel. The debate over medical care highlighted how little thought the community had given to Grace's welfare until this moment. Sheriff Bean raised his hand to quiet the discussion and restore order to what was becoming an increasingly chaotic situation. "Let's handle this properly," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his office. "Mr. Parker, you're under arrest for child abuse and neglect, and Miss Parker will be examined by a qualified physician and provided with temporary shelter while we sort out the legal aspects of this situation." The formal arrest sent shockwaves through the gathered crowd, many of whom had never seen local law enforcement take such decisive action in a case involving family disputes, particularly one initiated by the testimony of a Native American against a white resident. Silas's face cycled through disbelief, rage, and fear as the reality of his situation became clear. "You can't arrest me based on the word of some lying savage," Silas protested, his voice rising to a desperate shout as Sheriff Bean produced handcuffs from his belt. "I've got rights as a citizen of this territory, and I won't be railroaded by a bunch of bleeding hearts who don't understand the first thing about raising children in hard times." The appeal to legal technicalities rang hollow when measured against the evidence everyone could see. Lucas watched the arrest proceedings with satisfaction, but also with the wariness of someone who understood that legal victory was only the beginning of a longer struggle. His attention remained focused on Grace, whose shock at the rapid turn of events was visible in her pale complexion and trembling hands as she tried to process the reality that her father was actually being held accountable for his actions. "Miss Parker," Lucas said gently, approaching Grace as Sheriff Bean secured. Silas in handcuffs amid a stream of profanity and threats. "You're going to need more than just medical attention and temporary shelter. You're going to need someone to help you navigate the legal proceedings and plan for a future that doesn't depend on anyone who's hurt you." The offer of continued assistance carried implications that Grace was only beginning to understand. The crowd began to disperse as the immediate drama concluded, but not before several residents approached Grace with offers of help that ranged from temporary lodging to employment opportunities that would allow her to support herself independently. The sudden transformation from community pariah to object of protective concern was dizzying in its speed and scope. Dr. Matthew Richardson, the newly arrived physician Mrs. Henderson had mentioned, appeared at the edge of the remaining crowd, with his medical bag in hand and a professional demeanor that contrasted sharply with Doc Holliday's notorious reputation. "I understand there's a young lady here who needs medical attention for an untreated fracture," he announced, his Eastern accent marking him as a newcomer to territorial life. Grace looked at Lucas with an expression that mixed gratitude with uncertainty about what accepting his continued help might mean for her future independence. "I don't know how to repay you for what you've done," she said quietly, her voice still shaky from the emotional intensity of the past hour, "or even how to begin making decisions for myself after so long having them made for me by someone else." Lucas's response carried the wisdom of someone who'd faced his own struggles with finding autonomy after periods of powerlessness. "You don't repay kindness," he said simply. "You pass it forward when you're strong enough to help someone else who needs it. And as for making decisions, you start with small ones and work your way up to the big ones, just like learning to walk." Again after an injury, as Grace allowed Dr. Richardson to examine her arm, while Sheriff Bean led her father toward the jail, she realized that Lucas Riverbend had given her something far more valuable than rescue from her immediate situation. He'd given her the chance to discover who she might become when freed from the fear that had shaped every choice she'd made for months. The sun was approaching its zenith as the drama of the morning began to settle into the reality of changed circumstances that would require careful navigation and difficult decisions about Grace's future in a community that had suddenly awakened to its responsibility for her welfare. The hardest parts of her journey toward independence were still ahead, but for the first time in months she faced them with hope rather than despair. 2 weeks had passed since Grace Elizabeth Parker's world had been turned upside down by Lucas Riverbend's intervention, and she sat in the modest parlor of Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, carefully practicing her penmanship with her newly healed left arm, while the late afternoon sun streamed through lace curtains that represented a luxury she'd forgotten existed. Dr. Richardson had been forced to re-break her arm to set it properly, a procedure that had left her screaming in agony despite the laudanum he'd administered. But the result was a limb that would function normally once the swelling subsided and her strength returned. The boarding house had become Grace's sanctuary, a place where she could begin the slow process of remembering who she'd been before. Fear and desperation had consumed her identity. Mrs. Henderson had refused any payment for Grace's room and board, declaring that Christian charity demanded nothing less than complete support for a young woman who'd suffered so much at the hands of someone who should have protected her. The other residents had welcomed Grace with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity that felt overwhelming after months of being treated as invisible. Lucas visited every day, usually in the early morning before the town became fully active, bringing news of the legal proceedings against her father and updates on the various opportunities that were developing for Grace's future employment and independence. His presence had become the anchor point of her daily routine, a source of stability and guidance as she navigated the complex process of rebuilding a life that had been shattered by abuse and neglect. The transformation in Grace's appearance over the past fortnight had been remarkable, according to the women who had taken charge of her care and rehabilitation. Proper food, adequate rest, and freedom from constant fear had restored color to her complexion and brought life back to her eyes, while new clothing donated by sympathetic townspeople had replaced the ragged dress that had become her uniform during the darkest period of her life. Most importantly, her voice had grown stronger and more confident as she began to trust that expressing her thoughts and feelings would not result in punishment. This particular afternoon brought an unusual visitor to Mrs. Henderson's establishment, as Martha Clanton, wife of the territory's most prominent rancher, arrived in her finest carriage with an offer that could determine the entire course of Grace's future. Martha had built a reputation throughout Arizona Territory for her progressive views on women's education and her successful efforts to establish schools and libraries in frontier communities where such amenities were considered unnecessary luxuries. "Miss Parker," Martha said, settling into the boarding house's best chair with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command and respect. "I've been following your situation with great interest, and I believe I have a proposition that might appeal to a young woman with your obvious intelligence and unfortunate experience with the darker aspects of frontier life." Her words carried the authority of someone who was accustomed to having her suggestions taken seriously. Grace felt her pulse quicken as she recognized that whatever Martha Clanton was about to propose would likely represent a major turning point in her efforts to establish independence and purpose in her new life. The woman's reputation for supporting educational causes suggested possibilities that Grace had barely dared to hope for during her darkest moments of despair. "I understand from Dr. Richardson that you possess excellent reading and writing skills, as well as arithmetic abilities that surpass those of many men in this territory," Martha continued, her sharp eyes assessing Grace's reaction to the compliments. "And Lucas Riverbend has spoken very highly of your courage and determination in the face of circumstances that would have broken weaker individuals." The mention of Lucas's endorsement carried special weight, given his growing reputation as a man whose judgment could be trusted. The opportunity Martha outlined was both exciting and intimidating in its scope and potential for changing Grace's entire future trajectory. The territorial government was establishing a new school in the mining town of Bisbee, some 20 miles south of Tombstone, and they needed a teacher who could handle students ranging from young children learning basic letters to adult miners seeking to improve their literacy skills for better employment opportunities. The position would provide you with a modest but adequate salary, quarters above the schoolhouse, and most importantly, complete independence from anyone who might seek to control or exploit you, Martha explained, her tone carrying the conviction of someone who understood exactly how precious such freedom could be for a young woman in Grace's circumstances. "However, I must be honest about the challenges you would face." The challenges Martha described were significant and would require Grace to draw upon reserves of strength and determination she wasn't certain she possessed. Bisbee was a rough, mining town where educated women were rare and often viewed with suspicion by men who saw female intelligence as a threat to the natural order they preferred to maintain. Additionally, the job would require Grace to stand before groups of people and command respect through knowledge and authority rather than sympathy. Furthermore, Martha continued, her expression growing more serious, there are elements in this territory who would not hesitate to use your background against you if they felt it served their purposes. Your father's arrest has created enemies who blame Lucas Riverbend for interfering in what they consider private family matters, and by extension, they hold you responsible for allowing an outsider to challenge established social hierarchies. The political implications of accepting the teaching position were complex and potentially dangerous, as Grace would become a visible symbol of the changing attitudes toward women's rights and Native American influence in territorial affairs. Her success or failure would be scrutinized by those who opposed such changes, making her performance a matter of broader social significance beyond her personal circumstances. Lucas arrived at the boarding house just as Martha was concluding her explanation of the teaching opportunity, and Grace could see immediately that he'd been informed about the visit and its purpose. His expression mixed pride in Grace's potential advancement with concern about the risks she would face as a young woman pioneering in a hostile environment. "Mrs. Clanton has been generous in her offer," Lucas said, settling into a chair near Grace with the easy familiarity that had developed between them over the past 2 weeks. "But she's also been honest about the challenges you'd face, and those challenges are real and potentially serious." His tone carried the protective instincts that had led him to intervene in her situation originally. Grace found herself torn between gratitude for the concern both Martha and Lucas showed for her welfare and frustration at having her capabilities questioned before she'd even had the opportunity to demonstrate them. The months of being treated as helpless and worthless had created a deep hunger for the chance to prove her worth through achievement rather than survival. "I appreciate everyone's concern for my safety and success," Grace said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her. "But I've already survived things that would have destroyed the sheltered life I thought I wanted. And I've learned that hiding from challenges doesn't make them disappear." The declaration felt like stepping off a cliff, but also like finally standing on solid ground. Martha smiled with approval at Grace's response, recognizing the spirit that had attracted her attention initially. "Excellent attitude, my dear, and exactly what you'll need to succeed in Bisbee. However, you won't be facing those challenges entirely alone. I've arranged for you to have allies and support systems that will help you navigate the more difficult aspects of your new position." The support system Martha had established included correspondence with other teachers throughout the territory who faced similar challenges, regular visits from educational supervisors who could provide guidance and intervention when necessary, and most importantly, a network of progressive-minded citizens in Bisbee who were committed to the success of public education. Lucas leaned forward in his chair, his expression growing more serious as he addressed both women. "There's something else we need to discuss before Grace makes her final decision about this opportunity. Her father's trial is scheduled to begin next week, and the outcome could affect her safety and reputation in ways that extend far beyond Tombstone." The legal proceedings had been proceeding slowly through the territorial court system, complicated by the unprecedented nature of prosecuting a white man for child abuse, based largely on the testimony of a Native American witness. Public opinion remained divided between those who supported Grace's courage in speaking out and those who viewed the entire situation as government overreach, encouraged by outside agitators. Silas has hired a lawyer from Tucson who specializes in challenging the credibility of witnesses in cases involving racial tensions, Lucas explained, his words sending a chill through Grace as she realized her ordeal was far from over. "And his defense strategy will likely focus on portraying you as an impressionable young woman who was manipulated into making false accusations against a loving father. The prospect of having to relive her trauma in a public courtroom while having her truthfulness and mental competence questioned by hostile attorneys was terrifying enough to make Grace reconsider whether seeking justice had been worth the ongoing consequences. The idea of being cross-examined about the most painful experiences of her life while her father sat watching felt almost unbearable. Martha reached across the small parlor to grasp Grace's uninjured hand, her touch conveying both sympathy and determination. "My dear, if you're going to build a life based on truth and integrity, sometimes you have to fight for the right to do so. Running away to Bisbee before the trial would only give your father's supporters the ammunition they need to claim you were lying all along." The wisdom in Martha's words was undeniable, but it required Grace to find reserves of courage she wasn't certain she possessed, particularly when facing the prospect of public humiliation and potential legal consequences if the jury decided to believe her father's version of events rather than her own testimony. Lucas stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the dusty street where Grace had spent so many hopeless hours begging for coins that barely kept her alive. "There's another consideration we haven't discussed yet," he said without turning around, "and that's what happens to other young women in similar situations if we allow your father to escape consequences for what he did to you." The broader implications of the case had not occurred to Grace, who had been focused on her personal survival and recovery. But Lucas's words forced her to confront the reality that her situation was not unique and that her decision to testify or remain silent would affect more than just her own future. Throughout this territory, there are fathers who use their children as sources of income through begging, dangerous labor, or worse forms of exploitation. Lucas continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed such injustices repeatedly, and most of those children have no voice and no advocate willing to challenge the adults who abuse them. The moral dimension of her testimony added pressure that Grace had not anticipated. Dr. Richardson chose that moment to arrive for his weekly examination of Grace's healing arm, and his presence shifted the conversation toward the practical aspects of her physical recovery and readiness to take on the demanding responsibilities of teaching in a frontier community. "The bone has healed remarkably well," Dr. Richardson announced after completing his examination, his professional manner carrying reassurance that Grace desperately needed, and with continued exercises to rebuild strength and flexibility, "You should have full use of the limb within another month or two." The medical clearance removed one obstacle to accepting the teaching position. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across Mrs. Henderson's parlor, Grace found herself facing a decision that would determine not only her own future, but potentially influence the broader struggle for women's rights and protection of vulnerable children throughout Arizona Territory. The weight of such responsibility felt overwhelming for someone who had been powerless just weeks earlier. "I need time to think about everything we've discussed," Grace said finally, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone learning to make important decisions deliberately rather than reactively. "But I want everyone to know how grateful I am for the opportunities and support you've offered." The request for time felt reasonable given the magnitude of the choices before her. Martha gathered her belongings with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to managing multiple important projects simultaneously. "Of course, my dear, but don't take too long to decide about the teaching position. The school board needs to make arrangements for the fall term, and there are other candidates being considered if you choose not to accept." The gentle pressure was delivered with kindness, but carried the unmistakable message that opportunities in frontier territories were rare and should not be taken for granted. After Martha's departure, Lucas remained in the parlor with Grace, and the comfortable silence that settled between them spoke of the deep trust and understanding that had developed during her recovery period. His presence had become essential to her sense of security and progress toward independence. "Whatever you decide about the teaching position and the trial testimony," Lucas said quietly, his voice carrying a promise that Grace had learned to trust completely. "You won't face those challenges alone. That's not how this works, and it's not how it's going to work going forward." The commitment felt like the first truly reliable promise anyone had made to Grace in years. The Cochise County Courthouse stood like a monument to frontier justice. In the center of Tombstone, its adobe walls and red tile roof speaking of Spanish colonial influence, while its American flag proclaimed the territorial government's authority over all who sought legal remedy within its chambers. Grace Elizabeth Parker climbed the stone steps with Lucas Riverbend at her side, her heart pounding with a mixture of determination and terror as she prepared to face her father in open court for the first time since his arrest 3 weeks earlier. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with residents who had come to witness what many considered the most significant legal proceeding in the territory's recent history, not just for its examination of child abuse, but for its broader implications regarding the testimony of Native Americans in cases involving white defendants. Grace could feel the weight of dozens of stares as she made her way to the witness section, some carrying sympathy and support, while others held skepticism and outright hostility. Judge Samuel Morrison presided over the proceedings with the grave dignity befitting someone who understood that his decisions would establish precedents affecting the rights and protections of vulnerable citizens throughout Arizona Territory. His reputation for fairness and strict adherence to legal procedure had made him the natural choice for a case that was certain to generate controversy, regardless of its outcome. Silas Parker sat at the defendant's table beside his attorney, Harold Wickham, a sharp-featured man from Tucson whose expensive suit and polished boots marked him as someone who specialized in defending clients with more money than innocence. Silas had lost considerable weight during his imprisonment, and his normally ruddy complexion had taken on the pale, unhealthy cast of someone deprived of regular access to whiskey. The prosecution was handled by Territorial Attorney General Marcus Webb, a methodical lawyer who had built his career on cases involving the protection of women and children from domestic violence. His opening statement painted Grace's situation in stark terms that left little room for misinterpretation or excuse, methodically detailing the evidence of systematic abuse and neglect that had culminated in her father's violent assault. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Webb began, his voice carrying across the packed courtroom with the authority of absolute conviction. "You will hear testimony about a father who broke his own daughter's arm with a mining tool because she failed to bring home enough money from forced begging, then denied her medical treatment so he could use her untreated injury to generate sympathy from charitable strangers." The stark summary of the charges sent visible shockwaves through the assembled crowd. Defense attorney Wickham countered with an opening statement that portrayed Silas as a desperate man, driven to unfortunate extremes by economic circumstances beyond his control, while suggesting that Grace's testimony had been influenced by outside agitators who sought to use her situation for their own political purposes. His words carried the subtle racism and gender bias that still influenced many territorial legal proceedings. "My client stands accused based primarily on the word of a confused young woman who has been manipulated by individuals with their own agenda for undermining the natural order of family authority," Wickham argued, his tone suggesting that the real criminals were those who had encouraged Grace to speak out against her father. "We will demonstrate that Silas Parker, while perhaps guilty of poor judgment during a period of extreme financial hardship, is not the monster the prosecution would have you believe." The first day of testimony focused on establishing the facts of Grace's condition when Lucas had first encountered her, with Dr. Richardson providing detailed medical evidence about the severity of her improperly healed fracture and the signs of prolonged malnutrition and neglect he had documented during her initial examination. His professional testimony was devastating in its clinical precision. The injury to Miss Parker's left arm was consistent with a severe blow from a heavy, blunt instrument, Dr. Richardson explained to the jury, his words carrying the weight of medical expertise, and the manner in which it had been allowed to heal suggested deliberate denial of proper medical care. Furthermore, her overall physical condition indicated months of inadequate nutrition and chronic stress. Sheriff Bean followed with testimony about the arrest itself, describing Silas's behavior and statements on the day of the confrontation with Lucas, including his admission that Grace's begging provided their primary source of income and his angry defense of using her injury to generate charitable donations. The second day brought character witnesses who testified about Grace's intelligence, work ethic, and gentle nature during her school years, painting a picture of a bright young woman whose potential had been crushed by circumstances beyond her control. Mrs. Henderson spoke movingly about Grace's recovery progress and her obvious relief at being freed from her father's control. Lucas's Testimony on the third day was the most anticipated and potentially controversial element of the prosecution's case, as his status as a Native American made his credibility a target for defense attacks, despite his obvious education and respectability. His account of witnessing Grace's situation and intervening on her behalf was delivered with quiet dignity that impressed even skeptical observers. "I observed Miss Parker for 3 days before approaching her," Lucas explained to the packed courtroom, his voice steady despite the hostile stares from some spectators, and it was clear that she was being forced to display her injury in a manner calculated to generate maximum sympathy from passers-by. Her obvious education and refinement made it apparent that begging was not a choice she had made willingly. Wickham's cross-examination of Lucas focused heavily on his motivations for involving himself in what the defense characterized as a private family matter, with repeated suggestions that he had romantic or political reasons for challenging Silas's authority over his daughter. The racial undertones of these attacks were barely concealed and clearly designed to prejudice the jury against his testimony. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. "Isn't it true, Mr. Riverbend," Wickham pressed during his cross-examination, "that you saw an opportunity to insert yourself into the lives of white settlers by positioning yourself as a savior to a vulnerable young woman who might feel grateful enough to overlook your background?" The offensive question drew audible gasps from spectators who recognized its racist implications. Lucas's response to the attack was measured and dignified, refusing to take the bait while making it clear that he would not be intimidated by attempts to discredit him based on his heritage. "My motivation was simple compassion for someone who was clearly suffering abuse, the same motivation that would drive any decent person to intervene when they witness cruelty toward the defenseless." Grace's own testimony came on the 4th day, and she faced the witness stand with a mixture of terror and determination that was visible to everyone in the packed courtroom. Her voice shook initially as she began recounting the events leading up to her father's violent attack, but gained strength as she continued with her account. "He had been drinking more than usual that night," Grace testified, her words carrying across the silent courtroom with devastating clarity. "And when I brought home $3 instead of the 5 he had demanded, he became enraged and accused me of holding back money for myself. When I showed him that my cup was empty and tried to explain that it had been a slow day, he grabbed the mining pick handle from beside the door." The detailed account of the assault that followed was difficult for Grace to recount, and equally difficult for spectators to hear, as she described the sickening sound of her bone breaking and her father's immediate calculation of how her injury could be used to generate sympathy donations. Several jury members appeared visibly affected by her testimony. Wickham's cross-examination of Grace was brutal in its attempts to portray her as either a willing accomplice to deception or a confused victim of manipulation by Lucas and other outside influences. His questions were designed to humiliate and break down her credibility while avoiding direct accusations that might generate sympathy for her situation. "Miss Parker," Wickham began with false gentleness, "isn't it possible that your memory of these events has been influenced by conversations with Mr. Riverbend and others who have their own reasons for wanting to see your father punished?" The suggestion that her testimony was unreliable struck at the heart of the prosecution's case. Grace's response demonstrated the strength and clarity of thought she had developed during her recovery period, as she calmly refuted each attempt to discredit her memory or motivations. "Sir, no one could influence me to remember the sound of my own bone breaking or the feeling of my father's hands dragging me through the dirt to position me for begging the next morning. The defense's case focused heavily on character witnesses who testified to Silas's previous reputation as a hard-working mine foreman and his struggles with unemployment and depression following the closure of the Silver King mine. Several witnesses described his drinking as a response to circumstances rather than a character flaw. Silas himself took the stand on the final day, presenting himself as a broken man who had made regrettable decisions during a period of extreme desperation and financial hardship. His testimony was carefully coached to generate sympathy while avoiding direct admission of the most serious charges against him. "I never meant to hurt my Grace," Silas testified, his voice cracking with what appeared to be genuine emotion. "And I know I made mistakes when I was drinking and worried about how we were going to survive. But I'm her father, and everything I did was because I was trying to keep us both from starving in the streets." The prosecution's rebuttal focused on the systematic nature of Grace's exploitation and the deliberate denial of medical care that extended her suffering for weeks after the initial assault. Webb's closing argument painted Silas not as a desperate father, but as a calculated abuser who had profited from his daughter's pain. "The defendant asks you to believe that love motivated his actions," Webb told the jury in his final statement. "But love does not break bones with mining tools. Love does not deny medical care to injured children. And love certainly does not force young women to display their untreated injuries for charitable donations. What you have heard described in this courtroom is not desperate parenting, but criminal abuse." Wickham's closing argument appealed to traditional notions of family authority and warned against the dangers of government interference in private, domestic matters, while subtly playing on racial prejudices regarding Lucas's role in bringing the charges forward. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with a verdict that would establish important precedents for child protection throughout Arizona Territory. Judge Morrison called for silence as the foreman rose to announce their decision, and Grace felt her entire future hanging in the balance of the next few words. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Silas Parker, guilty of child abuse and neglect as charged," the foreman announced, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom, despite the immediately erupting chaos of reactions from spectators who had invested emotionally in the case's outcome. Grace felt her knees buckle with relief as the guilty verdict was announced, but her emotional response was complicated by the knowledge that her father would face imprisonment and that their relationship, however damaged, was effectively over. Lucas's steadying hand on her shoulder provided the support she needed to remain standing. Judge Morrison's sentencing speech emphasized the broader significance of the case while imposing penalties designed to protect Grace and deter similar crimes by other parents who might see their children as sources of income rather than individuals deserving protection and care. "Mr. Parker, you will serve 2 years in territorial prison and pay restitution for your daughter's medical care," Judge Morrison announced, his words carrying the weight of legal precedent. "And you are permanently prohibited from contact with Miss Parker without her explicit consent and the supervision of territorial authorities." As the courtroom slowly emptied and Silas was led away in handcuffs, Grace stood with Lucas and realized that the legal victory was only the beginning of the next phase of her journey toward complete independence and self-determination. The teaching position in Bisbee suddenly seemed not just possible, but necessary for proving that justice could lead to redemption and new beginnings. 3 months after her father's conviction, Grace Elizabeth Parker stood before her first classroom in Bisbee, Arizona Territory, watching 23 faces ranging from 6-year-old mining children to grizzled prospectors in their 50s, all united by their hunger for the education she had come to provide. The one-room schoolhouse perched on a hillside overlooking the Mule Mountains was rough-hewn and practical, with wooden benches arranged in neat rows and a blackboard that had seen better days. But to Grace, it represented everything she had fought to achieve. The morning air carried the sounds of the Copper Queen Mines operations, where hundreds of men descended daily into the earth to extract the red metal that had transformed Bisbee from a sleepy frontier settlement into one of the territory's most prosperous communities. Grace had arrived in town just as the autumn term began, her teaching supplies and personal belongings fitting into two modest trunks that represented her entire worldly possessions. Her quarters above the schoolhouse were spartanly furnished, but comfortable, with a small bedroom, a sitting area where she could prepare lessons and grade assignments, and a kitchen barely large enough to accommodate one person's simple meals. The independence these modest accommodations represented felt more luxurious to Grace than the finest hotel suite might have seemed to someone who had never known the terror of being completely dependent on another person's whims. Lucas had accompanied her on the journey from Tombstone to Bisbee, helping her transport her belongings and ensuring that the arrangements Martha Clanton had made were satisfactory for Grace's safety and success. His presence during those first difficult days of adjustment had provided the emotional anchor she needed while establishing herself in a community that viewed newcomers with typical frontier suspicion. The challenges of teaching such a diverse group of students were unlike anything Grace had experienced during her own limited formal education, requiring her to develop lessons that could simultaneously engage children learning basic alphabet recognition and adults seeking to improve their literacy enough to qualify for supervisory positions in the mines. Her evenings were consumed with creating different versions of the same material, tailored to various skill levels and learning capabilities. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, the wife of Bisbee's bank president and leader of the local Women's Improvement Society, had become Grace's primary ally and advisor in navigating the complex social dynamics of a mining community where education was valued but also viewed with suspicion by those who feared that learning might give workers ideas above their station. The key to success here, Mrs. Whitman had explained during Grace's first week, is demonstrating that education serves practical purposes rather than encouraging people to abandon their current circumstances. The mine owners support the school because literate workers are more efficient and less likely to be injured through misunderstanding safety procedures. Grace's students presented a fascinating cross-section of frontier society, from the Martinez, children whose parents had immigrated from Sonora seeking mining work, to elderly prospectors like Thomas McKenna, who had decided that learning to read contracts might prevent future swindling by unscrupulous business partners. Each student brought their own motivations and challenges to the classroom. Young Sally Morrison, daughter of a shift supervisor, showed remarkable aptitude for mathematics and devoured every book Grace could provide, representing the next generation of frontier women who might achieve educational opportunities their mothers had never imagined possible. Her enthusiasm for learning reminded Grace of her own childhood dreams and reinforced her commitment to providing quality education regardless of her students' backgrounds. The adult miners who attended evening classes after completing their shifts presented different challenges, as their hands were often too stiff and sore from physical labor to manage delicate penmanship exercises, and their exhaustion made concentration difficult during lessons that began after 10-hour workdays. Underground, Grace learned to adapt her teaching methods to accommodate their physical limitations while maintaining academic standards. Pedro Gonzalez, a shift foreman who spoke 3 languages but could read none of them fluently, became one of Grace's most dedicated students and eventually her assistant in managing the diverse needs of the classroom population. His natural leadership abilities and multilingual skills made him invaluable in helping other students overcome language barriers that might otherwise have prevented their educational progress. The autumn months brought their own rhythm to Grace's new life, with early morning preparation sessions before the children arrived, full days of instruction that tested her energy and creativity, and evenings devoted to grading assignments and planning lessons for the following day. The exhaustion was different from the bone-deep weariness she had experienced during her months of forced begging, because it came from purposeful work that contributed to her community's betterment. Lucas continued to visit Bisbee regularly, ostensibly to conduct business with various mining operations, but clearly also to check on Grace's adjustment to her new responsibilities and ensure that she was receiving the support and respect she deserved from local residents. His presence in town had initially generated some suspicion among locals, who were unaccustomed to seeing Native Americans in professional contexts. The relationship between Grace and Lucas had evolved during the months since her father's trial, growing beyond the protector and protected dynamic that had characterized their initial interactions into something more complex and mutually supportive. Grace had begun to understand that Lucas's commitment to her welfare was part of a broader mission to challenge injustice and protect vulnerable individuals throughout the territory. "You've become more than just a survivor," Lucas observed. During one of his visits, as they walked together through Bisbee's bustling main street, where miners, merchants, and families created the constant activity of a prosperous frontier community, "You've become someone who helps others find their own strength and capability." His words carried the pride of someone who had witnessed remarkable personal transformation. The recognition from Lucas meant more to Grace than any official commendation might have, because he had seen her at her lowest point and understood the magnitude of the journey she had traveled, from broken victim to confident educator. His validation of her growth carried special weight because it came from someone whose judgment she had learned to trust completely. Winter brought new challenges to the schoolhouse, as the high altitude and mountain location made heating the building a constant struggle that required careful management of the wood-burning stove to maintain comfortable temperatures for learning. Grace learned to arrive early each morning to start the fire and prepare the classroom for students who might otherwise face the choice between education and physical comfort. The mining company's decision to sponsor a winter reading program provided Grace with an opportunity to demonstrate her value to the community beyond basic literacy instruction, as she organized evening sessions where families could gather to hear stories and participate in discussions that brought literature to life for people who had previously considered books luxury items rather than practical necessities. Her success with the reading program led to additional responsibilities that expanded her role in the community, including serving on the committee planning Bisbee's first public library and advising the Territorial Education Department on curriculum development for other frontier schools. These opportunities represented the kind of professional recognition Grace had never dared imagine during her darkest days. The spring term brought news that would test Grace's newfound confidence and independence as Martha Clanton arrived in Bisbee with an offer to recommend Grace for a position supervising education programs throughout the southern Arizona Territory. The opportunity would mean leaving the classroom where she had discovered her calling, but it would also allow her to influence educational policy affecting thousands of children and adults. "Your success here has exceeded everyone's expectations," Martha explained as they sat in Grace's modest quarters above the schoolhouse, surrounded by student assignments and lesson plans that represented months of dedicated work. "And the territorial government needs experienced educators who understand both the challenges and possibilities of frontier education." The offer represented validation of Grace's capabilities that went far beyond her original goals. The decision facing Grace was complicated by her growing attachment to her students and her recognition that leaving Bisbee would mean abandoning the people who had become her first real community since her childhood years in Tombstone. The children especially had come to depend on her consistency and caring in ways that made departure feel like betrayal. Lucas's arrival in town coincided with Martha's visit, and Grace suspected that their timing was coordinated to provide her with support and guidance as she considered this new crossroads in her rapidly evolving life. His perspective would be crucial in helping her evaluate the broader implications of accepting or declining the territorial position. "The question isn't whether you're capable of handling greater responsibilities," Lucas said, as they discussed the opportunity during their evening walk through Bisbee's quiet residential streets. "The question is whether you're ready to take on the political challenges that come with influencing territorial policy rather than individual lives." His warning carried the wisdom of someone who understood how success could create new forms of vulnerability. The political aspects of the territorial position were significant and potentially dangerous, as Grace would become a visible symbol of women's advancement in professional roles that had traditionally been reserved for men. Her background as an abuse survivor who had successfully challenged her father's authority would make her a target for those who opposed changing social hierarchies. As Grace weighed the decision between staying in Bisbee with her established classroom and accepting the territorial position with its broader influence and greater risks, she realized that her choice would affect not just her own future, but the educational opportunities available to countless other young women throughout Arizona territory. The responsibility felt overwhelming, but also exhilarating. The students' reaction to news of the potential opportunity surprised Grace with its maturity and generosity, as even the youngest children expressed pride in their teacher's recognition, while acknowledging their sadness at the prospect of her departure. Their response demonstrated that her impact on the community extended far beyond simple literacy instruction. Pedro Gonzalez approached Grace privately with an offer that provided an unexpected solution to her dilemma about leaving her students without adequate instruction if she accepted the territorial position. "I have been thinking," he said in his careful English, "that perhaps I could continue the work here if you would help me prepare so the children do not lose what they have gained." The possibility of training Pedro as her replacement opened new possibilities for Grace's decision-making process, as it would allow her to accept the territorial position while ensuring continuity of education for her current students. His natural teaching abilities and deep connection to the community made him an ideal candidate for maintaining the programs she had established. The complexity of Grace's situation became even more apparent when she received an unexpected letter from her father, delivered through the territorial prison system and forwarded by Sheriff Bean, with a note expressing his own reservations about whether she should read correspondence from someone who had caused her such harm. The letter sat unopened on her small kitchen table for 3 days, while Grace struggled with whether confronting Silas's words would help or hinder her decision-making process. When she finally opened the letter, its contents were both surprising and disturbing in their apparent sincerity and desperate tone. Silas had written in careful, shaking handwriting about his regret for the pain he had caused, and his pride in hearing about her success as a teacher, though he stopped short of accepting full responsibility for the systematic abuse that had nearly destroyed her life. "My dear Grace," the letter began, "I have had much time to think about what I did to you and why, and I want you to know that seeing you succeed despite everything fills me with feelings I don't have proper words for. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I hope someday you might find it in your heart to understand that I was a broken man who broke the most precious thing in his world." The letter continued with details about his life in prison, his participation in a program designed to help inmates understand the impact of their crimes on victims and families, and his growing awareness of how his drinking and desperation had led him to justify actions that no father should ever take against his child. His words carried a tone of genuine remorse that Grace found both moving and infuriating. Lucas arrived for his regular visit just as Grace was struggling with her emotional response to her father's letter, and his immediate concern for her. Obvious distress provided the support she needed to process the complicated feelings the correspondence had triggered. His ability to understand her internal conflicts without judgment had become one of the most valuable aspects of their relationship. "He doesn't get to ask for your understanding now," Lucas said after reading the letter at Grace's request, his voice carrying controlled anger at Silas's attempt to seek absolution from the daughter he had systematically abused. "Not when you're finally building the life he tried to destroy, and not when his words might undermine the confidence you've worked so hard to develop." The wisdom in Lucas's response helped Grace recognize that her father's letter was fundamentally about his own need for emotional relief rather than genuine concern for her well-being, and that responding to it might reopen wounds that had finally begun to heal properly. The realization allowed her to set the correspondence aside and focus on the more immediate decision about her professional future. Martha's territorial position offer gained additional complexity when Grace learned that accepting it would require her to work closely with government officials who had opposed her father's prosecution and viewed her case as an example of federal overreach in local family matters. The political dimensions of the job were more extensive than initially apparent. The opposition Grace would face in the territorial position included not just bureaucratic resistance, but active hostility from powerful interests who viewed educated women and Native American influence as threats to established social hierarchies. Her success or failure would be scrutinized by those looking for evidence that women were unsuited for positions of authority and responsibility. Mrs. Whitman arranged a meeting between Grace and several wives of Bisbee's most prominent citizens to discuss the implications of the territorial offer and provide guidance from women who had navigated similar challenges in male-dominated professional environments. Their insights proved invaluable in helping Grace understand both the opportunities and obstacles she would encounter. "The men who run this territory will test you constantly," warned Mrs. Catherine Morrison, whose husband owned the largest mercantile operation in southeastern Arizona, "not because they necessarily want you to fail, but because they need to be convinced that a woman can handle responsibilities they consider naturally masculine. Every mistake will be magnified, and every success will be attributed to luck or male assistance." The conversation with Bisbee's leading women also revealed the extent to which Grace's story had spread throughout Arizona territory, inspiring other women to seek educational opportunities and challenge traditional limitations on their roles in frontier society. Her potential appointment to the territorial position would make her a symbol of progress that carried responsibilities beyond her individual career success. Grace's students began preparing special presentations and projects designed to demonstrate the effectiveness of her teaching methods and the progress they had made under her guidance, hoping that evidence of their improvement might influence her decision to remain in Bisbee rather than accept the territorial appointment. Their efforts touched her deeply, while also highlighting the personal connections that made leaving so difficult. Young Sally Morrison organized the older students in creating a written petition asking Grace to stay, complete with detailed explanations of how her teaching had affected their lives and future plans. The document represented hours of careful thought and composition that demonstrated their academic progress, while also serving as an emotional appeal for continuity. Pedro Gonzalez continued developing his teaching skills under Grace's mentorship, spending hours after his mining shifts, learning advanced instructional techniques and classroom management strategies that would allow him to maintain the educational standards she had established. His dedication to preparing for potential leadership responsibilities impressed everyone who witnessed his commitment. The mining company's superintendent, James Douglas, requested a private meeting with Grace to discuss the territorial offer and its implications for Bisbee's educational programs, revealing that corporate interests were also invested in her decision and willing to provide financial incentives for her to remain in her current position. "Miss Parker," Douglas explained during their conference in his elaborately appointed office overlooking the Copper Queen mine operations, "your work here has exceeded our most optimistic expectations for improving worker efficiency and reducing accidents caused by illiteracy. The company is prepared to offer you a substantial salary increase and additional resources if you would consider declining the territorial position." The corporate offer added another layer of complexity to Grace's decision-making process, as it represented recognition of her value from powerful interests, who typically showed little concern for educational matters beyond their immediate practical benefits. The financial security it offered would allow her to support herself comfortably while continuing the work she loved. Lucas's response to news of the mining company's offer was characteristically thoughtful and focused on the broader implications rather than the immediate benefits Grace might enjoy. His perspective helped her understand that her decision would influence not just her own future, but the precedents established for other women seeking professional advancement. The question isn't whether you can make a comfortable living teaching miners' children, Lucas observed during one of their evening walks through Bisbee's mountainous terrain. The question is whether you want to use your capabilities to influence educational policy for an entire territory, or focus your energy on the people you can reach directly through classroom instruction. The philosophical dimensions of the choice became clearer as Grace realized that both options represented valuable contributions to society, but they would require different types of courage and commitment from her. Staying in Bisbee meant deepening her impact on a specific community, while accepting the territorial position meant broadening her influence across a much larger population. Grace's correspondence with other teachers throughout Arizona Territory, facilitated by Martha Clanton's network of educational reformers, provided additional perspective on the challenges and opportunities associated with territorial-level work. Their experiences highlighted both the potential for significant impact and the personal costs of operating in highly political environments. The approaching deadline for her decision created increasing pressure from all the interested parties, who had invested emotionally or financially in the outcome of her choice. Grace found herself needing to establish boundaries that would allow her to make the decision based on her own values and goals, rather than others' expectations. As May turned toward June and the school year approached its conclusion, Grace organized a special ceremony to celebrate her students' achievements and publicly acknowledge the support she had received from the Bisbee community during her first year as a teacher. The event would also serve as the venue for announcing her decision about the territorial position. The celebration filled the schoolhouse and spilled onto the surrounding hillside as miners, families, business owners, and territorial officials gathered to witness the culmination of Grace's first year in Bisbee and learn about her plans for the future. The diversity of the crowd reflected the broad impact her work had achieved. Standing before the assembled community, with Lucas at her side and her students arranged proudly around the classroom they had transformed together, Grace felt the weight of responsibility for making a decision that would honor both her personal growth and her commitment to the educational mission that had given her life new meaning and purpose. "When I arrived in Bisbee 8 months ago," Grace began, her voice carrying clearly across the packed room, "I was a young woman who had survived terrible circumstances, but had no idea whether I possessed the strength and capability to build something meaningful from the pieces of my broken life." The opening acknowledgement of her journey resonated with listeners who had witnessed her transformation. The speech Grace had prepared would reveal not just her decision about the territorial position, but also her understanding of how the choice reflected the broader question of how survivors of trauma could best use their experiences to serve others facing similar challenges. As spring turned toward summer and the deadline for accepting or declining Martha's offer approached, Grace found herself standing once again at a crossroads that would determine the direction of her entire future. The scared young woman who had begged on Tombstone's dusty streets felt like a different person entirely, replaced by someone capable of making decisions that would affect the lives of thousands. Grace Elizabeth Parker stood before the assembled crowd at her year-end celebration, her hands steady as she held the speech that would announce her decision about the territorial education position. But her mind traveled back to that dusty morning in Tombstone when Lucas Riverbend had first seen past her broken arm to the person she could become. The journey from that moment to this one seemed impossible in retrospect. Yet here she stood, no longer a victim, but a woman whose choices would influence the future of education throughout Arizona territory. "I have spent considerable time weighing the generous offers that have been made to me," Grace continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke to faces that had become dear to her during her months in Bisbee. "And I have realized that my decision must be based not on what others expect of me, but on where I believe I can make the greatest difference in the lives of people who face challenges similar to those I have overcome." The crowd fell silent as they sensed that Grace was approaching the announcement they had all gathered to hear, and Lucas felt his chest tighten with anticipation as he recognized the tone of someone who had reached a decision that would require considerable courage to implement. Her transformation from broken beggar to confident leader continued to amaze him, even after witnessing it unfold over the past year. "I have decided to accept the territorial education position," Grace announced, her words sending ripples of surprise and disappointment through the assembled students and community members who had hoped she would remain in Bisbee. "But with conditions that will allow me to maintain my connection to this community and continue supporting the educational programs we have built together." The conditions Grace had negotiated with Martha Clanton and the Territorial Education Department reflected both her growing confidence in her own worth and her understanding of how to leverage her unique position for maximum benefit to the communities she served. She would split her time between territorial duties and regular visits to Bisbee, ensuring continuity while expanding her influence. Pedro Gonzalez stepped forward from the crowd with a mixture of pride and nervousness visible on his weathered face, as Grace had arranged for him to be publicly recognized as her successor and partner in maintaining Bisbee's educational programs. His journey from illiterate miner to certified teacher represented the kind of transformation that Grace's work had made possible throughout the community. Mr. Gonzalez has demonstrated exceptional dedication and natural teaching ability, Grace announced, placing her hand on Pedro's shoulder in a gesture that conveyed both respect and confidence. "And he will continue the work we have started here while also serving as my liaison for implementing new territorial education policies in mining communities throughout Arizona." The elevation of Pedro to official teaching status represented More than just a personnel decision, as it demonstrated Grace's commitment to empowering local community members rather than imposing outside authority on established populations. His appointment would also serve as an example of how educational opportunities could transform individual lives and strengthen entire communities. Young Sally Morrison, now 12 years old and reading at a level that would qualify her for advanced studies in any eastern city, approached the front of the classroom, carrying a leather-bound book that the students had created as a farewell gift for Grace. The volume contained writings, drawings, and photographs documenting their year together and their plans for continued learning under Pedro's guidance. "Miss Parker," Sally said, her voice clear and confident in a way that would have been impossible before Grace's arrival in Bisbee. "We want you to know that everything you taught us about believing in ourselves and working hard to achieve our dreams will stay with us no matter where you go or what important work you do for the territory." The presentation of the student-created book moved Grace to tears that she didn't attempt to hide, as it represented tangible proof that her impact on these young lives would continue long after her departure from daily classroom instruction. The investment she had made in their education was already paying dividends in their increased confidence and expanded aspirations. Martha Clanton rose from her seat in the front row to address the gathering, her presence lending official weight to the proceedings, while also demonstrating the high-level support Grace had earned for her educational work. Her words carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate announcement about Grace's new position. Miss Parker's appointment to the Territorial Education Department represents more than just individual advancement, Martha explained to the assembled crowd, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had influenced territorial policy for decades. It represents a recognition that the most effective educational leaders are those who understand both the challenges and possibilities of frontier life from personal experience. The political significance of Grace's appointment was not lost on the more sophisticated members of the audience, who understood that her elevation to territorial authority would make her a target for those who opposed women's advancement and Native American influence in government affairs. Her success or failure would be scrutinized as evidence for broader debates about social change. Lucas approached the front of the classroom after Martha's remarks, carrying a small wrapped package that contained his own farewell gift for Grace, as she prepared to take on responsibilities that would require her to travel throughout the territory and interact with officials who might not share his respect for her capabilities. "Grace," Lucas said, using her first name publicly for the first time since their initial meeting outside Murphy's General Store in Tombstone. "This represents not just my pride in your accomplishments, but my confidence that you will continue to fight for those who cannot fight for themselves, wherever your work takes you." The gift Lucas presented was a compass made of silver and turquoise, crafted by Navajo artisans, with symbols representing the four directions and the importance of finding one's true path despite obstacles and opposition. The compass was both beautiful and practical, designed to guide travelers through unfamiliar territory while reminding them of their essential values and commitments. Grace accepted the compass with hands that trembled slightly as she recognized the depth of meaning behind Lucas's gift and his public acknowledgement of their partnership in the work of protecting vulnerable people and expanding educational opportunities. The compass would travel with her throughout Arizona Territory as a reminder of the principles that had guided her journey from victim to advocate. The ceremony concluded with a communal meal featuring dishes contributed by families from throughout Bisbee's diverse population, creating a celebration that reflected the multicultural harmony Grace had fostered in her classroom and the broader community connections her work had strengthened. The gathering demonstrated how education could serve as a bridge between different cultural groups. As evening approached and the crowd began to disperse, Grace found herself alone with Lucas on the hillside, overlooking the Copper Queen mine, where the lights of the night shift created a constellation of human activity against the backdrop of the Mule Mountains. The moment felt like a natural conclusion to the chapter of her life that was ending and a beginning for whatever lay ahead. "You realize," Lucas said quietly, his voice carrying both pride and concern, "that accepting this territorial position means you'll face opposition from people who see your success as a threat to their own power and privilege. They'll try to discredit you, undermine your authority, and make you doubt your own capabilities." Grace's response reflected the hard-won confidence she had developed through surviving abuse, rebuilding her life, and proving her worth through meaningful work that had transformed not just her own circumstances, but those of everyone she had taught and inspired along the way. "Let them try," Grace replied, her voice carrying the steel that had been forged through months of facing down hostile cross-examination, community skepticism, and her own self-doubt. "I've survived worse than anything they can devise, and I've learned that the only way to prevent others from suffering what I suffered is to fight for systems that protect the vulnerable instead of exploiting them." The conversation that followed covered practical matters related to Grace's transition to territorial responsibilities, including the schedule of visits that would allow her to maintain her connection to Bisbee while fulfilling her new duties throughout Arizona territory. Lucas would continue to provide support and guidance as she navigated the political complexities of her expanded role. 3 months later, Grace's first major initiative as Territorial Education Coordinator involved establishing emergency educational services for children in mining camps where no formal schooling had previously been available. Her programs focused specifically on communities where child labor was common, and educational opportunities were seen as luxuries rather than necessities. The resistance Grace encountered from mining company officials who viewed education as a threat to their labor supply was intense and sometimes personally vicious, with attacks on her character and background designed to undermine her authority and discredit her programs. However, her experience with courtroom testimony had prepared her for such challenges, and she met each confrontation with the calm determination that had become her trademark. The most serious opposition came from William Ashford, a powerful mining magnate who controlled operations throughout southeastern Arizona and had built his fortune on the backs of workers who remained ignorant enough to accept dangerous conditions and minimal wages. His campaign to have Grace removed from her territorial position included spreading rumors about her relationship with Lucas and questioning her moral fitness for a position of authority. Miss Parker's appointment represents the worst kind of political favoritism, Ashford declared during a territorial legislative hearing designed to review her performance, placing an emotionally unstable woman with a history of family troubles in a position where she can disrupt the natural order that has made Arizona Territory prosperous and peaceful. His words carried the coded language of those who opposed any challenge to established power structures. Grace's response to Ashford's attack demonstrated how completely she had mastered the political skills necessary for survival in territorial government. As she calmly presented documented evidence of her program's success, while systematically dismantling his arguments without appearing defensive or emotional, Mr. Ashford's concerns about disrupting natural order are interesting, Grace replied. During her testimony before the Territorial Committee, particularly since the natural order he defends includes 10-year-old children working 12-hour shifts in dangerous mines instead of learning to read and write, which might eventually qualify them for safer, better-paying employment. Her counterattack highlighted the moral bankruptcy of opposing education. The hearing became a public forum for debating broader questions about the role of government in protecting vulnerable populations and promoting social mobility through educational opportunities. Grace's supporters included not just Martha Clanton and progressive reformers, but also practical business leaders who recognized the economic benefits of an educated workforce. James Henderson, owner of the territory's largest freight company, testified that Grace's literacy programs had significantly improved the efficiency and safety of his operations by reducing accidents caused by workers who couldn't read safety instructions or shipping labels. His support carried weight with legislators who prioritized economic considerations over social reform. The testimony of Grace's former students provided the most powerful evidence for the effectiveness of her educational approach. As young adults who had learned to read and write under her guidance described how those skills had transformed their employment prospects and life opportunities. Their articulate presentations demonstrated the practical value of frontier education. Pedro Gonzalez traveled from Bisbee to testify on Grace's behalf, his journey representing both personal loyalty and professional recognition of how her mentorship had enabled his own transformation from illiterate miner to respected teacher. His presence added credibility to Grace's claims about the potential for educational programs to elevate entire communities. Before Miss Parker came to Bisbee, Pedro explained to the Legislative Committee in carefully measured English, "I could not read the safety warnings that might have saved my friends from mine accidents. I could not help my children with their schoolwork, and I could not dream of any future beyond digging copper from the ground until my body gave out." His testimony personalized the abstract benefits of education. The committee's decision to retain Grace in her territorial position while expanding her authority and budget represented a significant victory, not just for her personally, but for the broader principle that government had a responsibility to protect and educate all citizens regardless of their social status or economic circumstances. Lucas attended the hearings as both a supporter and a strategic advisor, his presence serving as a reminder of the coalition between progressive whites and Native Americans that had made Grace's rescue and subsequent success possible. His quiet dignity impressed even skeptical legislators who had expected him to be less articulate or sophisticated. The expansion of Grace's territorial authority allowed her to implement comprehensive educational reforms that addressed not just basic literacy, but also vocational training, adult education, and specialized programs for immigrant communities whose children needed instruction in both English and practical skills for frontier life. Her success in establishing educational programs throughout the territory was measured, not just in statistics about enrollment and literacy rates, but in individual stories of transformation that echoed her own journey from powerlessness to empowerment. Each child who learned to read represented a victory against the forces that sought to keep vulnerable populations ignorant and exploitable. The creation of teacher training programs became one of Grace's most significant achievements, as it ensured that educational improvements would be sustainable even if political winds shifted and support for her initiatives wavered. By training local residents to serve as educators, she was building institutional capacity that could survive changes in territorial leadership. Maria Santos, a young Mexican-American woman who had learned English in one of Grace's adult education classes, became the first graduate of the teacher training program and established a bilingual school in the border town of Nogales. Her success demonstrated how Grace's educational philosophy could bridge cultural and linguistic divides. The annual teacher conferences Grace organized brought together educators from across Arizona territory to share methods, discuss challenges, and coordinate efforts to expand educational opportunities into the most remote and underserved communities. These gatherings created a professional network that strengthened the entire territorial education system. Dr. Emma Richardson, who had arrived from Boston to serve as territorial health officer, became one of Grace's closest allies in advocating for comprehensive services that addressed both educational and medical needs of frontier communities. Their collaboration demonstrated how different reform movements could support each other. Education and health are inseparable in frontier communities, Dr. Richardson explained during one of their planning sessions, because children who are malnourished or suffering from untreated injuries cannot learn effectively, while illiterate adults cannot understand basic health information that might prevent disease and accidents. Their integrated approach proved remarkably effective. The establishment of lending libraries in mining camps and rural settlements represented another innovation that extended Grace's educational impact beyond formal classroom instruction, providing ongoing learning opportunities for adults who had completed basic literacy programs but wanted to continue developing their knowledge and skills. Thomas McKenna, the elderly prospector who had been one of Grace's first adult students in Bisbee, became a traveling librarian who carried carefully selected books to remote mining camps and helped establish reading groups where isolated workers could gather to discuss literature and current events. His enthusiasm for learning inspired many others to pursue education. Grace's personal relationship with Lucas deepened during this period as they worked together on educational initiatives that required coordination between territorial authorities and Native American communities. Their partnership evolved beyond professional collaboration into something more intimate, though both remained focused primarily on their shared mission. The question of marriage arose naturally as Grace's position became more secure and their emotional connection strengthened, but both understood that such a union would generate controversy that could undermine their work and provide ammunition for political opponents who already questioned their relationship. "The work we're doing together is more important than social conventions," Grace observed during one of their private conversations about their future, "and I won't risk the educational programs that serve thousands of children just to satisfy traditional expectations about how unmarried men and women should interact." Her priorities reflected the hard-won wisdom of someone who had learned to value substance over appearance. Lucas's response demonstrated his understanding of the sacrifices required for meaningful social change and his willingness to subordinate personal desires to their shared commitment to protecting vulnerable populations through educational advocacy and reform. The 5th anniversary of Grace's appointment to territorial authority was marked by a ceremony in Phoenix that brought together students, teachers, community leaders, and government officials to celebrate the transformation of education throughout Arizona Territory. The gathering provided an opportunity to assess accomplishments and plan for future challenges. Governor Lewis Hughes delivered remarks praising Grace's achievements while announcing additional funding for educational initiatives and the establishment of a territorial college that would provide advanced training for teachers and other professionals. His support represented mainstream political acceptance of educational reform as essential territorial development. The statistics presented during the anniversary celebration were impressive by any measure, documenting dramatic increases in literacy rates, school attendance, teacher training completions, and community support for educational initiatives throughout Arizona Territory. However, Grace focused her remarks on individual stories rather than numerical achievements. "Numbers tell part of our story," Grace explained to the assembled audience, "but the real measure of our success lies in the letters I receive from students who have used their education to build better lives, establish businesses, serve their communities, and most importantly, ensure that their own children will have opportunities that were denied to previous generations." Sally Morrison, now 18, and completing her teacher training at the Territorial. In college, served as the student representative at the ceremony and announced her plans to establish a school for Native American children whose educational needs had been largely ignored by existing programs. Her commitment represented the continuation of Grace's legacy into the next generation. The ceremony also featured the presentation of a scholarship program established in Grace's honor, providing financial assistance for promising students from low-income families who wanted to pursue advanced education but lacked the resources to attend college or specialized training programs. On a warm spring afternoon 2 years after leaving Bisbee, Grace returned to visit her former students and found Pedro Gonzalez leading a classroom of 43 students, ranging in age from 5 to 65. The program had expanded beyond her most ambitious dreams, with students who had learned under her instruction now serving as teachers in other communities. The reunion with her original Bisbee students provided Grace with the deepest satisfaction she had ever experienced, as she witnessed how the educational foundation she had provided had enabled them to pursue dreams that would have been impossible without literacy and numeracy skills. Their success validated every sacrifice she had made. Young Sally Morrison, now 14 and serving as Pedro's assistant while preparing for advanced studies at the Territorial College, approached Grace with news that represented the ultimate validation of the educational philosophy that had guided her work from its beginning in Bisbee. "Miss Parker," Sally announced, with the confidence of someone who had internalized the lessons about self-worth and determination that Grace had taught through both instruction and example. "I've been accepted to the teacher training program at the University of Arizona, and when I graduate, I want to start schools in communities